Hello everybody, I'm Andrea Miller and I'm a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator at community hospitals and wellness centers in Bryan. Today we're outdoors at the Rotary Pavilion in Garver Park right across from the hospital, and I'd like to welcome you all to Live It, Not Your Mama's Squash. Unless you're one of my sons, and then it is your mama's squash, unfortunately. So today we're going to be featuring some different types of squashes. Everybody knows the typical butternut squash. Everybody has probably had an acorn, maybe a spaghetti squash, which you see some of those varieties here. But we're going to talk about some different types of squash that are delicious at this time of year. The weather is perfect today. It's about 65 degrees out here and the chill of fall is in the air, so I am super excited for squash season, and squash is one of my favorite foods, so I am all in to this episode today. So today we're going to be doing a couple different recipes. We're going to be doing a turkey and quinoa stuffed squash. So today we're going to feature some smaller varieties of squash that can be stuffed very easily and make for a really pretty presentation. And then I'm also going to show you how to cut the squash a couple different ways and just do a simple roasting of the squash. So we're going to go ahead and get started. The first squash we're going to be using today is a delicata squash. So I actually grew some delicata squash in my garden as well this year, and mine looks a little bit different. So the one thing about squash is the same variety can appear a lot differently. So sometimes it's hard to tell, what type of squash you're working with. But this is the squash that I grew in my garden. As you can see, it's teeny tiny. And since today's recipes involve roasting the squash, I actually pre-roasted one of my garden squash at home that I'm going to be using. But this is a delicata squash that I found in the store. So as you can see, it's just a little bit more bumpy and rigid. So we're gonna go ahead and cut it, and you can cut it in some different ways. So when I roasted it at home, I cut it lengthwise, but I'm gonna do it a little bit differently right now just to show you some different options. I'm gonna cut off the ends of the squash to make a nice flat bottom. And then I'm gonna cut it right down the middle. And we're gonna make like little squash cups. So as you can see, there's seeds in the middle of the squash. So I'm gonna go ahead and scoop those out. And now the seeds of the squash are actually perfectly edible. So I would highly recommend saving the seeds and roasting them in your oven. I just put a spritz of olive oil and whatever seasoning you like on them. And just roast them. Last night I roasted some. And I just did it at 350 and it took, maybe 10 to 15 minutes to roast. So there you go, you scoop out the seeds so it's hollow on the inside, and that's where we're gonna be putting our filling. So it's not a huge serving, so really, one or two of these would be a serving. So again, you'd scoop out the seeds. I'll scoop out this one too. So these squash seeds are high in healthy fats, fiber, and a lot of minerals. They're especially rich in the nutrients zinc, magnesium, and iron. So they're definitely worth saving. Just like your pumpkin seeds, so super easy to roast. Okay, so I already have some pre-roasted, like I said. So this is what I roasted at home. So again, it's one of my tiny squashes from home. And so what I do, as you can see, I'm just using a glass pan, and again, my squash was tiny, so I just used a teeny tiny glass pan, but you'll want one that fits your squash. And then I'm going to take these out for a second. But what you would do is you put it cut side down in the dish, and then just pour a little bit of water in the dish and roast it for about 30 to 40 minutes, or until it's tender at about 350 degrees, until again it's nice and tender. So I'm going to take this out and set it aside real quick. Actually, I'm going to put this back in here. So once it's done and it's fork tender, you're going to just set it aside. And really, while it's roasting, you can make the filling. So we're going to get started with our filling next. And our filling has a lot of different options. Like I said, today we're going to be doing, hopefully it gets hot enough in this pan today, since it's a little bit chilly out here. So it's a non-stick skillet, so I'm just putting my 1 pound of turkey right in there. Hand sanitizer. And then we're gonna give it some sausage flavors. Now, if you wanted to just substitute sausage in here, you could, and then you could leave out some of the spices. But for a little bit healthier version, I'm just gonna use, again, a lean ground turkey, and I'm just gonna add some spices right on top of it to make it kind of taste like sausage. So I'm adding about 1/4 of a teaspoon of ground sage, 1/4 of a teaspoon of rosemary, 1/4 of a teaspoon of thyme. And I like it a little bit spicy, so I'm gonna add 1/4 of a teaspoon of crushed red pepper, but that's optional. If you don't like spicy foods, you can leave that out. And then 1/4 of a teaspoon of pepper. And I'm gonna add just a tad bit of salt right now, not much, just to kind of season the meat. But we're gonna add more probably at the very end of it. And you can add that to taste, but I found approximately 1/2 of a teaspoon for this amount of stuffing was what tasted good. So, but again, you can adjust that to taste. If you are trying to cut back on salt, you can use less. So just go ahead and brown the meat and stir in the spices. So I'm just making sure all the spices are nicely incorporated into the turkey. And so like I said, our other main ingredient in this recipe is quinoa. So you can play with the amounts a little bit if you want. If you want more of a plant-based recipe, you can use less meat and more quinoa, or you could use all quinoa if you wanted. You could swap in some lentils or some beans in place of the turkey if you wanted to go all vegan or vegetarian. So there's lots of options with this. This is just a basic recipe. You can kind of make it your own. Okay, so now we're gonna add some onions and some red pepper. This is something that you can customize as well. Specifically the red pepper. If you could use any color of pepper that you had on hand. It doesn't have to be red. I just thought red looked nice. You could also use carrots or celery, any type of vegetable you wanted in this recipe. So lots of different options. So we're just going to use about 1 cup of each of them. Again, you can tailor this to your personal taste as well. Trying to keep an eye on my turkey. Now I have some little bee friends joining me. We were saying we were lucky that there were no bees out here today, but it looks like they've found us. So I have about 1 cup of onion, and I'm just going to throw that right on into the meat. About 1 cup of red pepper as well. And I'm going to give this a little stir. Since we're using lean ground turkey, you don't really need to drain it. There's not going to be a whole lot to drain. In fact, if you're not using a non-stick skillet like I am, you may need to add a little bit of olive oil to prevent it from sticking to the pan. And that's okay too. So that's looking good. I'm gonna just chop my red pepper now. You want it kind of finely diced so everything ends up about the same size. And I'm not really measuring here. You don't really need to measure for this recipe. Just kind of eyeball it. Again, this is something you can, really customize to your personal taste. And I'm gonna just toss that right in there as well. It can all cook together. So as you can see, it's already starting to look really pretty with that red pepper in there. The red gives it a really nice touch. And red peppers are really rich in vitamin C. So this is a really healthy, immune boosting recipe. And it's just so warm and comforting. I'm just kind of trying to make sure that the meat is all nice and chopped. Looking good. All right, so we're gonna let that cook just a little bit more. But while we do that, I'm gonna talk about some other options other than our delicata squash that you could use to stuff, basically, with whatever you like, whether it's this recipe or something else. So if you are having trouble finding a delicata squash, you can definitely use your standard acorn squash. So you can find these all year round at pretty much any grocery store, any farmer's market. They're very available. So if you can't find any of our special squashes, you can just use a very basic acorn. So again, you just cut it down the middle, and it would give you 2 nice servings. For this recipe, I would use, if you're using a squash this size, I would use about 2 of them. If you're using a teeny squash like I have, teeny tiny squash like I have, you'd probably need 4, maybe even 5 or 6 of those little guys. So I have some other interesting squashes here to show you. So I found this one at our local farmer's market as well. So this is actually an acorn squash as well, but it's a white acorn squash, which is a more rare version of acorn squash. An acorn squash also comes in an orange color. So you can experiment if you don't want to go too far out of the box. Just trying some different varieties of acorn squash might be a first step. This one right here I thought was really, really pretty. As you can see, it's kind of a golden orange color with some darker and lighter streaks of orange, and then on the bottom it changes color and it's green. So this is called a carnival squash, and it's actually a cross between an acorn squash and then another squash called I think it's a sweet dumpling squash. So it's a cross between those two. So this one's really pretty as well, and would make a really beautiful presentation to stuff. So I'm gonna give this another quick stir. It's looking really good, still a little bit pink. So we'll give it a few more minutes. Once you stuff this squash, we're just gonna stick it back in the oven for a few more minutes, like 10 minutes or so. And that's just gonna make sure everything is nice and heated through. And we're gonna add some cheese at the end. So it's gonna make sure the cheese is all nice and melted. So we really wanna make sure the filling is, completely cooked before we put it in the squash. The bees definitely think this smells good, I'll tell you that. Okay. The other squash that I have over here, I have a standard spaghetti squash. So you could put the stuffing in this squash. This the spaghetti squash is a little bit more stringy in texture, kind of like, you know, spaghetti. So a lot of people will scoop that out and actually use it in place of spaghetti. It wouldn't be my favorite choice for stuffing for this recipe anyway. And then I wanted to show you this squash as well. I got this squash right across the street at St. John's Produce. And the reason why I wanted to bring it is because it looks a lot like our delicata squash that we were using. But this is not a delicata squash. Squash can be a very confusing topic because they can all look a little bit different. This is actually, the inside texture of this one is going to be more like a spaghetti squash. So again, this probably wouldn't be a squash that I would use to stuff. Not that it would be bad, you could. You probably only need one of these for this recipe. But again, the inside is going to be just a little bit more stringy. So this one is a cross between a delicata and a spaghetti squash. Looks like our bee's taking a little swim there. All right, and our olive oil. Taking a little bath, an olive oil bath. All right. Yeah, lots of friends. You know, I feel bad for the little guy because I'm not one to hurt our pollinators. I love our pollinators, but that guy, that's his own doom there. I had nothing to do with that. So anyway, that's looking good. Everything's nice and fine. So now I'm going to add our quinoa. And I'm going to add about a cup of cooked quinoa, so not raw. Make sure it's cooked. You're just going to cook it per recipe instructions. So again, how you cook quinoa, you would take, for this recipe, you need about a half cup dry quinoa. Make sure you rinse the quinoa to get off all of that bitter taste. And then you would cook it in a pot with double the amount of water as quinoa, so 1 cup of water. Bring it to a boil and then simmer for roughly 15 minutes until it's nice and tender. So another reason I love this recipe is because you can experiment with different grains. So if you're not a quinoa person, that's fine. Go ahead and just use some rice. Maybe some wild rice or brown rice would be nice in this recipe. You could also use like some bulgur or farro. You know, really anything goes. So get creative and try some different types of grain in this recipe. So that looks done. I'm gonna turn off the heat and I'm gonna add, you know, a little bit of I'm using Monterey Jack cheese. You can use a variety of different cheeses in this recipe. So I'm adding about 3/4 of a cup of cheese and just kind of stirring that around, mixing it all in. And then I'm going to use a spoon and I'm going to stuff my little mini squashes here. These are so cute. I like anything that's mini. It makes a perfect like individual serving size. And again, I'm going to have a lot of leftover stuffing because I'm just stuffing 2 mini squashes right now. If you have any leftover stuffing after you're done stuffing your squash, you know, the filling is really excellent on its own too. So definitely don't let it go to waste. And then just sprinkle a little bit of cheese right on top. And these are going to go right back in the oven. Except I don't have an oven out here, so I'm going to just set these aside. And I'm gonna make my own little oven here so that we can get a finished product. Sorry, bees. There's 2 bees in there now. I'm gonna put just a tiny bit of olive oil in here. Turn this on again. Place my little squashes in there. And I'm gonna cover it up and see if we can get the cheese to melt so that you can see what it's gonna look like at the very end. And while we're waiting for that, I am going to talk about and show you one more quick recipe. We forgot our garlic. You would usually put garlic in the stuffing too. You don't have to. If you don't like garlic, I know my coworker Tara doesn't like garlic, so she can try this filling maybe. Or she's actually allergic to garlic. Gives her some stomach issues. She's sitting over there, so. So the last thing we're gonna do is I'm gonna talk about, this is my favorite squash. I know it doesn't look all that pretty, but it is just the best thing that you will ever sink your teeth into. And this is called a kabocha squash, or it's a Japanese pumpkin, it's sometimes called. And it is just super, super sweet on the inside. And a lot of people would be intimidated by this, wouldn't think that it would taste very good. But I'm gonna chop it open here and I'm gonna show you what I do with my kabocha squash. So you need a good chef knife to do this. Like a little paring knife is not going to do the trick. So make sure you have a good knife to cut it open. So these are sometimes hard to find. I found this one at the farmer's market again. If you find one of these, snatch it up because it is absolutely delicious. My favorite way to eat these is just to simply roast them. So that's what I'm gonna show you how to do. And you can see the inside of it is just a vibrant, beautiful orange color. And it also has some seeds on the inside, which again are edible and rich in nutrients, so you can save those and roast them right along with your delicata. And scoop them out. They're a little bit different. As you can see, they're a lot bigger and just a little bit different looking. Scoop out all the seeds. So you really could stuff this as well. That would be an option. I'm telling you though, I like to eat this for breakfast. I've been known to roast up a bunch of kabocha squash and it gets nice and golden brown when you roast it. The skin is actually edible, so you can leave the skin on and you can eat that, or you can remove it either before or after cooking. I like to cook it with the skin on, and then again that gives you the option. You can either eat it or you can just peel it off as you're eating it. So I just slice it in little slivers like this. Cut off that little stem there. Grab a roasting tray. I lay them out on my roasting tray. And drizzle them with a little bit of olive oil. And you're actually going to rub the olive oil all over it on both sides. And while I'm doing this, I actually want to show you another way that you can cut the delicata squash. That would be a really pretty presentation. You can slice it in little circles, and actually the delicata squash, you can eat the skin of that as well if you'd like. So you can slice it in little circles, and that makes, again, for a really pretty presentation roasted. I'm just gonna do this whole one here. And again, just drizzle it with a little more olive oil. Get this out here. And then again, I just rub the olive oil all over it just to make sure it's all covered. Your hands get nice and oily. And then a little bit of salt and pepper as well on top of there. And then again, I just throw it into about a 400-degree oven for about 15 to 20 minutes or until it's fork tender and starting to brown a little bit. And it's just delicious. The roasting really brings out the natural sweetness of the squash. And it's just fabulous. And actually the kabocha squash, to give you an idea of what it tastes like, it tastes a lot like a butternut squash. The flesh is just a little bit more dry though, actually very similar to a sweet potato. And to give you an idea on the nutrition facts of it, it's actually a lower calorie and lower carb option to either one of those. It has about 40 calories, actually both the delicata and the kabocha have about 40 to 50 calories and about 10 grams of carbohydrate per cup. So it's a very low calorie, low carbohydrate food. And in comparison, a sweet potato has about 200 calories per cup and around 40 or so grams of carbohydrate per cup. So definitely a lower calorie, lower carb option. And the flavor is just to die for. It's my go-to fall food. So if you can get your hands on some of these interesting squashes, you're definitely going to be thankful, and you're in for a treat. So let's take off our lid here so you can see the cheese has melted and it looks gorgeous. I can't wait to dig my teeth into these beautiful squashes. So thank you for joining me for today. For Not Your Mama's Squash. And I look forward to our next Live It together. Have a great day, everybody.